You're listening to the Money Shift Podcast, a podcast that helps you downshift on bad financial habits and change gears to smarter strategies. We're talking about more than just debits and credits. We're paving the fast lane to financial freedom. Here's your host, Jack Paglo.
Welcome to another episode of the Money Shift Podcast. I'm Jack. We have Eric Jordan with us. And this time we are going to be talking about probably one of the most misconceived financial topics in all of accounting and tax world, financial world for, auto shop owners. Certainly car enthusiasts are very familiar with this. Small business operators, probably heard about it a time or two as well. So really a broad topic, but we are going to be talking about the Montana Sales Tax LLC sales tax avoidance strategy. So there's a lot wrapped up in there, but essentially what we're talking about here is, we got some money in the bank. We like some cars. We're looking at maybe buying an RV, maybe buying a high dollar sports car or a bigger truck, something like that. But we don't want to pay the sales tax. I'm in New York. You're in Illinois, California. There's plenty of states with ludicrously high sales tax. So, if we're looking at buying a $200,000 vehicle, it could mean saving, $15,000, $20,000 potentially in sales tax. So that's really where this scheme, for lack of a better term, started gaining some traction. So, whether you've heard it on YouTube, maybe you've heard a story from, podcasts like this or something else, but basically what will happen is somebody will open a Montana LLC, usually through a registered agent to keep, the privacy there, but also the registered agent acts as a front for the address. That address allows them to then register the car in Montana, because they don't need to have any inspection or physically be present to do that. And then therefore the car is registered, they drive it in their home state, they use it in their home state, but they're not paying that $15,000 extra in sales tax. So there's a lot to unpack in this one, but Eric, kind of what are your initial thoughts as I threw a bunch of stuff out there?
I appreciate the creativity of those out there. They're trying to find ways to save on taxes. Biggest issue right here is it legal, right? Is this something that we can actually do, actually execute? It can, right? If you want my initial take, it can be something that can be executed. It can be perfectly fine legal. But you have to execute some things to make that happen. And my guess is most of those who are running this scheme are likely not.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where we're going to quickly find ourselves into a conversation of, whether it's the opportunity cost, the time invested, the additional legwork to save, a few $1,000s. Is this worth it? And is the exposure that you could be opening up on the backside also worth it?
Let's think about who does this make sense for to even think about it, right? Let's start with the normal shop owner. Nothing extravagant. Maybe I buy a few loaner cars, 10, 15 grand. Maybe I got a work vehicle, truck, something like that. And there's another, let's just call that 80 grand. We got $100,000 to $150,000 of vehicles. That shop owner, let's just say they're located in Illinois or New York or California. Let's just call it 10% sales tax rate. I know Illinois will be lower. Maybe New York might be higher. California is probably higher. We're saving 10 to 15 grand in tax, right? That sounds pretty interesting. But where's the value around, or what is the return on investment on that, right? Hey, we were going to save some money there. What do we need to execute to make that happen? Obviously you talked about forming the Montana LLC, and that's a very easy process to go form a Montana LLC. You can then register the vehicle. You don't have to physically be there in person, right? That makes it easier. What other things do we need to think about to get that executed?
Well, so, to fill in a couple of gaps here, I did a little bit of a research study, for lack of a better term, because Eric knows that I'm a proud new owner of a 1992 Ford F-150. And so in trying to get prepared for this podcast, I decided to call around not only to some insurance companies, which was a different can of worms that I frankly didn't even think about unpacking, but from a purely like executing on the moving pieces, you basically summed it up. It's get the car, open up the LLC, register the car to the LLC. Maybe we're talking about, we'll round up and call it $1,500 in total expenses. You're probably going to pay around, 500 or so to the registered agent. You're going to have to pay the cost to register the truck, or truck in my case. This was certainly not meeting the thresholds of cost to justify, but regardless, pay the cost to register whatever vehicle we're talking about to Montana. Then at that point you need to insure it. Other than registering it, at that point the vehicle is on the road. So the biggest thorn in my side in just trying to work through this as an exercise seems to come with insurance. Before we even get into, what are the potential repercussions from, whether you're state or federal government or anything like that, I called probably the three biggest insurance companies that we all think of on a day-to-day basis, or at least in that group: State Farm, Geico, and Allstate. Not one of them would touch it. Not one of them said that they would insure that vehicle, and this was on the commercial side. So I wanted to make sure we were talking about commercial insurance. So I called from a commercial policy and even on the personal side. So whether, from a personal standpoint or a commercial standpoint, none of those entities were willing to insure it.
Wait. Let me get this straight. So that means I can't just put it under my personal car insurance if I go and register under this Montana LLC?
Potentially. So that's what I thought was very, very interesting. And I think this is where, as the scheme kind of gets unpacked a little bit and people become more and more familiar with this, we're seeing the insurance companies sort of step in and say, you know what, this really doesn't seem above board. We're not even going to allow it to happen, because they probably don't want to be associated with that type of a risk. Because how are you, God forbid, you wreck your Ferrari and it's in Florida, or it's in, North Carolina or New York or wherever, but it's registered in Montana. What the heck's it doing there? That's the first question you have to ask. Oh, maybe I was on vacation, but you're good. That's, now you're really on a slippery slope from an exposure perspective.
Do you think anybody who's investigating, this is going to ask that question, right? What's this vehicle doing here, right? IRS audits you and they say, what do you got a Montana LLC for? The state takes a look. What do you got a Montana LLC for? How about what they're doing out in California?
I think, and you're right. We talked about this a little bit, I think, offline one point, but yeah, they're actually encouraging people to rat you out in California if they see a Montana tag in your driveway for an extended period of time. And, wow. We can talk about the incentives there at a different time, but regardless of all that, that's the level of enforcement we're starting to see. But you always say, is this going to pass the sniff test? And, from my perspective, I love the idea of this, just like you were saying in the very beginning. Very creative way to maybe save a few $1,000s and, keep your assets maybe a little bit more protected, because our Montana is, more of a state that encourages privacy. So, you kind of get to win on both sides of there. But the second you start sniffing around this and what's this car doing in this state? Anytime I see a Montana plate in New York, I immediately know what they're doing. And usually it's on a car that costs $100,000. So it's not like we're talking about my F-150 Montana farm truck that I actually did get from Montana. But regardless, it's, it immediately starts asking a lot of questions for somebody who might start sniffing around. And yeah, I think so. We're kind of transitioning into where we need to be here. The enforcement is really becoming a lot more real, but there are times when this actually could also make some sense. So maybe we can kind of, to play devil's advocate a little bit, obviously this might make some sense if you live in Montana, but this isn't probably the podcast you're going to be listening to, because you don't have to worry about the sales tax. So what happens, like maybe, we're storing the car in a different state, but we actually do business in Montana, and maybe there's some, kind of less dark gray, less black areas, and, kind of a little bit okay, but maybe slightly something we need to be aware of.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, right. So let's think about it. Let's just paint like two cases. One case is going to be, I'll call it a paper only presence in Montana, right? To a certain degree, right? All we're doing is we're doing a registration. We file an LLC. That's pretty much both those things are pushing paper, and we're paying a registered agent.
Sorry.
Exactly, right? So paper only, right? That's one item. A state, I think anybody's going to ask, like, what business purpose do you have to execute this?
Sure.
And you're probably not going to be able to answer that question.
Well, especially not if you wreck your Ferrari in New York State. And most of the time, Ferraris aren't going to do so hot in Montana unless you're on a very specific road. But, trying to stay away from comedy hour here.
Yeah.
Let's say, Montana's a beautiful state. There's a lot to do there from somebody who likes the outdoors. Maybe I want to actually spend 6 months of my time there, 183 days, whatever it actually may end up being, to call residency legal. And maybe it is a second or a first primary location. And then, I work remotely. I, operate my business out of there. How legitimate could that be? Does that increase that legitimacy at that point? Because now we probably can get a Montana driver's license. Now we can really establish residency and make a little bit more sense.
Well, when you break down all the individual steps in their essence, right, none of the things you're doing are illegal, right? It's the combination of these things with no substance behind it, right? Gotcha. The more substance you add to it, the better your case, right? The only thing that makes it relatively illegal is in a handful of states, they've persecuted this, gone to court, and the courts ruled in favor of the state, saying that this is pretty much a sham. And in all those cases, they are all what I'll call paper presence style. If we go to say say I got a cabin out in Montana, like you said, I can do business out in Montana. There's a business purpose for me to be out there executing whatever I need to execute for my business. So I have my own real estate. I'm not using a registered agent now. Now I have a piece of real estate. Maybe I still use a registered agent, but I also list a legal address for my LLC as well. And that's not the registered agent's address. So now I got a little bit of dirt there, right? It's a little bit more substance. It's not just paper.
I mean, that's, if you want substance, that's about as substantial as you can get. But
exactly.
I think that's where it kind of goes back into, certainly the things that, how can we encourage, the outside the box thinking without taking on, risk to a point where it becomes uncomfortable. And, that's where, like, without that on paper, with only that on paper presence and without that real tangible, something substantial, it feels like it's not worth it from my perspective. And kind of walking between the insurance, we're not even talking about, just the hoops you have to jump through for insurance is not worth it. And then all of a sudden you take your fancy little sports car or you have your RV or something happens to it. Forget about any of the other aspects we're talking about. They're probably not going to want to honor that policy because there's some sort, they could at least make an argument that there's some sort of fraud potentially there and they don't want to pay out on it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we're always going to encourage our clients, here in the state of Illinois, we have a pretty gnarly estate tax that can strip a lot of the wealth that you've built and want to transition to your heirs. So we're always having conversations with our Illinois residents, especially if they already have property in, say, Wisconsin or Indiana or Florida or another one of these no estate tax states. And we're saying, hey, you already have a purpose to have localities here. How do we make this 6 months in a day and transfer your primaries to that address? And now you're all of a sudden a resident of another state and we can avoid this tax. And like I said, they already have the substance, right? They already have precedence on why they're doing it. It's not, hey, I'm renting an Airbnb for 6 months in a day for just an address, or even worse, right? I'm just using a PO box up in Wisconsin, and that's how I'm going to try to escape my estate tax. I kind of akin that very similar to this Montana LLC scheme, where if I'm if I have no business being in Montana other than to register my vehicles there to avoid sales tax, I don't know how you're going to ever win that case. The only purpose of all of that is to avoid tax.
Yeah.
And
well, I think that's at the end of the day, when if we just look at this from the most simplistic perspectives, that's all this is. It's just to avoid the tax. And that's what makes it so hard to, at the end of the day, make it past that sniff test. And I think that's where it's really hard for somebody like you or I to put, even a half of a stamp of approval on this, because it's really hard to justify that until you start getting some of that substantial business interest in that state.
Hey, Montana's a super interesting state. Go buy a ranch.
Exactly.
If you can afford those expensive cars, go buy a ranch. You can go out, take your Lamborghini out to your ranch and hunt some elk or something.
It might have to be one of those Lamborghini Storados with the lifted all-wheel drive or whatever kit. But that's the only thing that's probably going to make it. But so maybe I don't want to buy that ranch. Maybe I don't want to do this. But I like playing in this shade of gray. I want to take on this risk. I don't mind, being a little bit of a bad boy. What's the worst thing that could possibly happen to me?
That's a good point, right? Risk of exposure is going to be that sales tax that you didn't pay, and then penalties and interest on that amount. And obviously, the larger the risk you take, the larger the reward it was. So now, could they go through some additional persecution and attack you for, try to call it fraud? You can get into some scarier waters there if the looser it is, the higher the risk they're going to call this thing fraud. And you don't want to have a court case when you Google your name and you have a court case pop up for fraud. It starts closing some doors for you, to save on some sales tax.
Regardless of what type of business you're operating, it's not a good look.
Exactly. Hey, I'm going to go work for Jack. I'm going to Google his name. Oh, fraud's the first thing that pops up when I do that.
Oh, he's not paying me.
Yeah. What's the likelihood this is going to be a successful long-term career for me? Questionable. But what could you do, right? Big thing we can look at is, do I have property in a different state? Maybe not Montana. I know Montana's the most friendliest state, right? It's got all those nice attributes to it. It makes it the ideal person or place to do this. Maybe there's another state. You already have a cabin. You have a second residence. You have a second location, right? Maybe your business is primary might have been in one state and you have a second location in another state. That state's so much more friendly. It's much more tax advantageous. Well, shoot, you already got all the resources set up. Let's just go focus on maximizing the benefit of having that second location there. We're going to look at doing that. There's a very good business use for it. And if you got neighboring states, I can think of one client of ours that has locations in Illinois and Indiana. Well, guess where I'm probably going to think about registering all my vehicles?
Illinois.
Yeah, of course. You got it. When the resources are there, right, you might already have the setup there to make it more successful. It might not be as great as Montana, but you have all the resources there, right? Be a little creative. Say, hey, I have these things. Right? This is what the podcast is for, right? We're not going to be able to tell everybody exactly what to do. But I might stop and say, hey, I do have this situation that might make sense. And I might not even have any idea, but I'm going to ask my trusted advisor and say, anything we can do. Here's my situation. Here are my attributes. Anything we can do with this. And it's our job to take all the facts, put together, create a plan to execute, save you money on some tax.
Yeah. At the end of the day, an hour-long conversation, hopefully it doesn't even need to be an hour-long conversation. A 15 to 30-minute conversation with your trusted advisor will really figure out if this is, or help you figure out if this is the right move for you. And, I think about it from the New York perspective. Everybody knows the term snowbird up here because everybody who gets older immediately goes down to Florida. But that's exactly what you're talking about is, we have this second home potentially. Florida is also a great spot to have that, primary residence, maximize that. And, we don't need to worry about incrementally more exposure for, to save another penny. And, I have a favorite expression here that I know you love, but juice is worth the squeeze. There we go. It's the juice is worth the squeeze quote. The juice isn't really worth the squeeze when you have these other options that are much more legitimate to not attract this interest. And, I think that's really where this is. It's a very nuanced subject. There's a lot of different things to think about as you're finding your success in, have a little bit of extra cash to go spending on. It's really easy to want to pursue something like this. But at the end of the day, it's just, there's a lot of other options. And that's where that trusted advisor comes in. Relying on those resources, tell them your situation and say, maybe it actually makes more sense, like you're saying, to just maximize this stuff over here. And we're really just missing the forest through the trees on this whole Montana thing. And at the end of the day, that's kind of what I thought about going into this. And then, here we are. So.
Yeah. Awesome.
Well, anyway, if you're thinking about making a big vehicle purchase, talk to your trusted advisor, reach out to us at Kaizen. We love finding a way to make sure we're legitimately maximizing your deductions, whether it's Section 179 bonus, maybe it's, legitimate tax repositioning, depreciation strategies, whatever that may be, that's where that advisor comes into play and do it the right way. If it can't pass that sniff test that you said, then you probably shouldn't really be doing it. So with that said, thanks for listening and hope you all have a great rest of your day.
You've been listening to the Money Shift Podcast. Make sure to subscribe and share with someone who needs a little shift in their financial life. See you on the next stretch of the road.